By the time Bitcoin is $1 million, you're looking at an MSTR share price of a minimum of $35,000 a share at today's dilution. This is why I don't believe in that fucking power law, right? And Spaghetti Boy and his bullshit. Because at the end of the day, you've got so much capital here, and the only thing that's going to happen is an S curve adoption here. And you're going to hit a J curve moment where all of this capital not only has to study it, but has to allocate. And because of the finality of the asset, has to allocate now before their competitors do it. So,
A term I heard you coin, British, was the forever cycle. Do you think
yeah.
this underpins the forever cycle? What happens when trillions of dollars a year are flowing into Bitcoin to recapitalize that? We're looking at a $250 market for Bitcoin, which is 1,000x on where we are now, price wise. We could wake up to a 10x overnight once one of these central banks gets serious about this. So,
Yeah, what happens when MicroStrategy is a $500 billion company and it's not going to take that long to do that, and then they go and dilute 100% of that, and the share price doesn't move? That this gets scary real quickly because
the biggest pools I look at, and this is where the corporate bond offering is going to get really interesting, I think, circa 300 trillion bond market that MicroStrategy is going to start harvesting really, really hard. I think
the sailor himself only, MSTR's purchasing only, puts a floor price of $40,000 for the next year, $80,000 for 2026, and it's like, what happens to this quote unquote bear market, right? So I said, MSTR could blunt this bear market, and I think that
I think the expectation of 21 billion over the next 3 years is going to be light. I think they're going to realize there's a whole lot more capital available than the 21 billion that they're after. And I wouldn't be surprised if that number gets revised upwards 2 to 3 times from here.
let's not forget, BlackRock is the second largest shareholder in MicroStrategy, right? The reason why this model is working out is because I think, if I was being a conspiracy theorist, that it is a
So Bitcoin has just hit a new all-time high this week, and I thought, hey, it could be perfect timing to get the two most bullish people in Bitcoin on the same call. So Peter, British, welcome. Today, I think we should start talking about MicroStrategy because the GigaChad himself has just announced to buy $42 billion worth of Bitcoin over the next handful of years. Who wants to jump in and chime in on that topic first?
it doesn't matter. We've both got bullish perspectives on this. Look, at the end of the day, how do you announce that you're going to basically dilute 100% of the value of the company, and the share price doesn't move, right? That's what happened. They announced $21 billion of ATM selling. They announced $21 billion of debt borrowing, and the share price basically said, perfect. The share price didn't move, didn't do anything, which shows you how hungry the market is for a volatile asset like MicroStrategy. And I've been saying this, like MicroStrategy is becoming a platform upon which you can, if you're an institutional investor, you can speculate on the underlying volatility, or the volatility of the underlying asset, which is Bitcoin. And that in itself is a financial product, which is, yes, it is because of Bitcoin, but it's not exclusive to Bitcoin. This has been happening for years. It's the reason why McDonald's got a lot of funding, because they wanted to borrow to a company that had all that real estate assets, right? So it's the same proven model. It's just now being executed by Saylor on Bitcoin. So it's phenomenal what's going on, and I think it continues to chug forward.
I think we've all conceded in the space that Saylor is the smartest of us as far as the Bitcoiners go, in the corporate sense anyway. And I don't want to degrade the efforts of everyone to date, but I think he's our best representative. What's amusing for me from a credit side of things is that he's just announced an additional 21 billion to an existing $4 billion of corporate bonds that he has outstanding, and his business has free cash flows of $50 million, if that. So he has been able to leverage that up well over 1,000 times his free cash flows to borrow money, and the market will pay it. They'll give it to him. They want to throw money at him. This is the thing that defies all belief. And to your point, the other side of that balance sheet, British, is he's diluted the stock by 100% and it's gone nowhere. And then he's just issued 21 million, or announced to issue 21 billion in stock on cash flows of $50 million a year. Now tell me any balance sheet, any household on earth that would be allowed to borrow hundreds, if not thousands of times their free cash flow. Yet here we are. So
yeah, I mean, put that in perspective for the listeners. Like, again, I want to double click on that. He's bringing in $50 million of cash flow a year, and he's essentially going to go out there and borrow nearly 1,000 times that. 50 billion, nearly.
Yep. And the other thing that's really interesting, and I'd love to hear British's take on this, is that he's issuing it at circa less than 1% interest rate. Yet we've got the Federal Reserve issuing it between 4 and 5%. So what you're telling me is MicroStrategy is now the risk-free asset in bond land?
Yeah, it is the asset that everybody wants because it provides the most volatility for them to trade. And I mean, the returns are phenomenal, right? We'll see what happens when these convertible bonds come up to issue. And I think they'll be subscribed again because, where else can you find this level of volatility if you're a convertible bond trader at this point? You just can't do it. MicroStrategy is the only asset that's going to give you that.
Best performing bond, best performing equity on earth. That's where this totally redefines markets. And what I find really curious is talking to traditional finance guys. I was chatting with a guy who's a stockbroker who's a Buffett acolyte, absolutely loves his work. And I said, you've got to look at this stock. I'd love to get your thoughts. He said, great. What does it do? I said, it just buys Bitcoin. I said, it's trading at a 2 times NAV. It was 2 times a month ago. And he said, why don't I just buy the underlying? And I was like, oh, you don't understand it. Like, he's basically buying at a discount. So you want that premium. And as that premium expands, the ability to get discounted Bitcoin enables him to buy more Bitcoin at a cheaper rate. So when Bitcoin's trading at $70,000 and he's got a MNAV at 3 times, or 3 times market cap to the underlying Bitcoin, he's effectively getting a 66% discount on the Bitcoin that he's buying. And as that premium expands, the discount gets deeper and deeper. So I'm not smart enough to figure out what could go wrong with this, but it looks like a really good setup for that MNAV to expand. And a lot of people look at that and think, oh, there's no way I want to buy an asset that's got a premium to the underlying net asset value to the company. But in this case, I actually think therein lies the opportunity, not the problem. And if you think about this from a valuations perspective, if we think we're going into a bull market for the next 12 months, and we're going to get I believe we're going to get somewhere between the 3 to 10x in the price of Bitcoin, we're effectively paying next year's price for MicroStrategy today. So we're only paying 1 year's times earnings because it's going to be that value. The underlying is going to be the MNAV in 12 months' time from now.
And the addition to that is that the convertible bond market doesn't give a shit about the MNAV because all they want is the volatility. So as long as they have the volatility side of it, they don't care what the MNAV is because they're not looking for exposure to the underlying Bitcoin. They're looking for exposure to an asset, a tool, a financial tool that gives them the volatility that MicroStrategy gives them. However, MicroStrategy gets that is up to MicroStrategy. But the actual convertible bond market is not interested in the underlying Bitcoin to a certain extent because all they want, the asset to them is the volatility. So you could see that MNAV expand quite handsomely and they'll still keep buying. And then you've got index inclusions that are coming in now. The Nasdaq, I think, is on the 29th of November. Then you've got the S&P 500 into next year, I think January time next year. So there's just capital here that retail is not going to be able to understand. Value investors are not going to be able to understand because the capital. Saylor has done a great job at basically turning MicroStrategy into a platform of speculation on Bitcoin for which institutional capital, they have nowhere else to go to do this. It is the only solution.
Speaking of, MicroStrategy, you released a really interesting video yesterday, British. It was a coincidence. I was just watching it this morning, but MSTR is up by like 2 to 3x on its 2021 price. And I actually expected a lot of people to be pushing capital into the ETFs over MSTR. I've been shocked at how well MSTR has performed, this year with the inclusion of these ETFs. Have you got any thoughts on that kind of scenario, British? And
yeah, so I bought the first transaction I did on MSTR was August 12th, 2020, which was the day after they announced that they were moving to a Bitcoin treasury. And I profited quite well off of that. The mistake in analysis that I made was that I was looking at it, kind of like a high net worth retail investor, which was MSTR was a de facto ETF because that's what I was told, right? This is a de facto ETF for 2.5 years. And then an ETF is coming out, which is super efficient, it's just liquid, right? So of course MSTR is going to be hit. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to trim back my MSTR position, and I was right for about 3 weeks, and then I was incredibly wrong for about 4 or 5 months, and now I've changed my thinking on it, and I realized that the way I was looking at MSTR as an ETF product, but it's not. It is an institutional speculative product on Bitcoin. And that market doesn't care about MNAV. That market doesn't care about the ETFs. That market wants volatility and it's going to get volatility one way or the other. And so there's capital now that doesn't really care about what happens to Bitcoin. It just has to buy that volatility and it will buy that volatility. And MSTR is the only solution. So why did it do so well? It did so well because there's just pools of capital out there that are bigger than what people can imagine, that are chasing exactly what MicroStrategy as a financial tool is offering.
The biggest pools I look at, and this is where the corporate bond offering is going to get really interesting, I think, circa 300 trillion bond market that MicroStrategy is going to start harvesting really, really hard. I think the expectation of 21 billion over the next 3 years is going to be light. I think they're going to realize there's a whole lot more capital available than the 21 billion that they're after. And I wouldn't be surprised if that number gets revised upwards 2 to 3 times from here.
Yeah, what happens when MicroStrategy is a $500 billion company and it's not going to take that long to do that, and then they go and dilute 100% of that, and the share price doesn't move? That this gets scary real quickly because that capital is always, Peter knows this, right? Capital is always looking for a home. It needs to be productive. And if MSTR is going to offer that productivity, then that's where the capital is going to go, which is why I put that video and I said, I think, by the time Bitcoin is $1 million, you're looking at an MSTR share price of a minimum of $35,000 a share at today's dilution.
It's so nuts.
That's the difficult thing. And for us looking at this, it's all accretive for Bitcoin, MicroStrategy doing this. So I think all Bitcoiners benefit from Saylor's aggressive acquisition of Bitcoin. It's the first time I think in history we've had a game that can be played that is not a zero-sum game. This is a game that everyone can benefit. So MicroStrategy shareholders, bondholders, and Bitcoiners are all going to benefit from this game that Saylor's playing.
Yeah, and remember, he's putting a floor in the market, right? So for the next 4 or 5 years, there's going to be a Saylor floor in the market. He's not going to be able to dilute that ATM, in rapid fashion because it will murder the stock price. But he's basically based on the schedule that they talked about. And I did a video with Ben Workman on this on my channel, literally earlier today. So I don't know when you're going to put this out, but it'll already be out on my channel whenever we put this out. And we walked through that, and it's like basically Saylor himself only, MSTR's purchasing only, puts a floor price of $40,000 for the next year, $80,000 for 2026, and it's like, what happens to this quote unquote bear market, right? So I said, MSTR could blunt this bear market, and I think that is going to happen this time. I'm more confident that happens based on this raise that they're doing.
A term I heard you coin, British, was the forever cycle. Do you think this underpins the forever cycle?
Yeah, I think, I think this is the type of thing that can do that, right? Because imagine you've got this going on, then you've got the US coming in with a 1 million Bitcoin strategic national reserve. You've then got, at that point now, every other company has to look at it, right? Especially once it's in the NASDAQ. Because if you're an allocator to the NASDAQ, you now need analysis on every company in the NASDAQ. So now you're looking at what is the bet, like, this is why I don't believe in that fucking power law, right? And Spaghetti Boy and his bullshit. Because at the end of the day, you've got so much capital here, and the only thing that's going to happen is an S-curve adoption here. And you're going to hit a J curve moment where all of this capital not only has to study it, but has to allocate. And because of the finality of the asset, has to allocate now before their competitors do it. So none of that other price modeling bullshit makes any sense to me. And because of all of this, right? You just don't understand how rapidly the capital can come in.
But it's never made sense, British. Like, this isn't something we're just talking about now. We've been beating the drum about the power law here for a long time, like all year. And it's not just this recent MicroStrategy announcement to buy $21 billion or $42 billion worth of Bitcoin. That's, the reason why we believe the power law won't work. There's so many reasons for why we just don't think modeling the price of Bitcoin is going to work. Do you want to dive into a few more of the reasons for why you think the power law is just a flawed model?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a math PhD, but I don't need to be to know that that's a piece of bullshit. And that's the crazy thing about it, right? Like, I don't understand. I'm not a math PhD, a physics scientist, or wherever the fuck he studied his bullshit from. But I'm not sitting there going, I'm going to look at the past 14 years of data and try and extrapolate it out into a fucking curve and tell you what the prediction is when there's so much more demand coming in. And the conversation the debate, quote unquote, debate that I had with him, started coming out with all cockamamie bullshit, trying to say that, the power law predicted when Larry Fink was going to come in. The power law predicted when Michael Saylor was going to come in. And it's just like, doesn't make any sense. Capital needs a home, and we are about to rapidly find out what happens when institutions, on an institutional level, retail capital is very slow, right? I'm sure Peter can second this. Retail capital is extremely slow. It drips. Once institutional capital finds out what the opportunity here is with MicroStrategy, Bitcoin, and everything else, it's going to be like a fire hose has been opened up because they need returns. And the only thing that you can go, compare it to is 2019, 2020 on Tesla, right? Go and have a look at what happened to Tesla when Russell 2000 asset managers were like, we all need a fucking allocation right now. And Tesla went vertical. That's what's going to happen with Bitcoin, except the difference is you can't dilute Bitcoin, right? You can't just go and make more Bitcoin. So now you have, it's just a revolving door of capital that has to keep coming in, and that's it. So no model that is basing future projections based on previous events is going to succeed here. And by the way, even if it does, a model that tells you, I think the price of Bitcoin is going to go from 50,000 to $5 million, and anywhere between there makes the power law correct, you are a fucking moron if you think that's valuable.
Yeah. I look at the Tesla example you use. I like to think of the nickel market that happened in March 2022, where the price of nickel went up 300% overnight. Now, nickel's a pretty common material. We can mine as much of that shit as we want. And you compare that to Bitcoin, like we could wake up to a 10x overnight once one of these central banks gets serious about this. So to your point, British, I think maybe a little softer on the tones of what I think about the power law, because I'm interested in creating interest around Bitcoin from an academic perspective. But I tend to agree that basically your models will be destroyed when this happens. And then that won't account for a central bank buying it. It won't account for, like, the thing we talked about before. You look at Microsoft or Apple, they've got 1,000 times the free cash flow that MicroStrategy has. What happens when they implement a Bitcoin strategy like MicroStrategy? All of a sudden, there's just unlimited demand for this thing, and there really is unlimited pools of capital that can be foisted into it. So I look at this and think this can happen a lot quicker than we think. And to your point earlier, there's so many things happening for MicroStrategy that are going to put this and this strategy on a global footing, and people won't be able to ignore it anymore because it'll be in their face. And then you've got tailwinds of FASB accounting rule changes happening 1st of Jan next year, possible inclusion in the NASDAQ, any of the other indices, the S&P 500. All of a sudden, like, people are going to have to buy this and pay attention. And once they sort of peel the onion layers back and realize what this thing is, I think it's going to inspire a whole host of people to do this. And this is where, say in the S&P 500, nearly 20% of the companies in that index are zombie companies, just existing to meet interest payments. All of a sudden, they now have an opportunity to take on a growth strategy that exceeds Apple or Nvidia or anything else in the market. So I look at this and think this could be a renaissance. This could be a golden era for US capital markets, and all financed and powered by Bitcoin.
And let's not forget who's actually behind this, right? It's President Larry Fink, right? At the end of the day, I don't care who the fuck you're voting for in America, whether you think you're voting for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. At the end of the day, the real president is Larry Fink. And we know how powerful BlackRock is at moving capital around the world. And he himself said it on the earnings call. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said it doesn't matter, who the president is, Bitcoin is becoming an adopted asset and it will continue along that adoption curve. So as Bitcoin becomes an ESG 2.0 asset, as Bitcoin becomes this growth, good for environment, et cetera, BlackRock is going to help companies do this. I think MicroStrategy, let's not forget, BlackRock is the second largest shareholder in MicroStrategy, right? The reason why this model is working out is because I think, if I was being a conspiracy theorist, that it is a blueprint testing ground for how we wake up the American stock market, like Peter said. I think, and when you study how BlackRock moves, this is how they do things. This is why when I was talking about, all the moves that are going to happen after the ETF was filed for, it's why they came true because they have a working blueprint for how to make an asset a fully adopted asset in a capital market. They are professionals at it, and it's going to happen. What happens when, BlackRock, who I guarantee you right now understands that one of the advantages of Bitcoin versus their previous favorite asset, which was real estate due to the mortgage-backed securities and everything else, has no societal, drawbacks. You can pump as much money into Bitcoin as you want, make it go to the moon and make it come crashing back down and do all kinds of things. No one's going to be homeless. No one's going to jump out of a building because they can't pay their mortgage. There is no societal negative impact based on using Bitcoin and as an asset to pump extra capital into. What happens when they realize, right? What happens when they start implementing that strategy? Property prices start coming down. You start losing monetary premium in real estate. By the way, property prices don't need to technically come down in dollar terms. They can come down in value terms simply by just keeping them stagnant for the next 10 years, right? Keep property prices stagnant for the next 10 years, and suddenly you have a rebalanced property portfolio in the property market in the US. So there's a lot happening here, and it's all happening at the stem of BlackRock and what BlackRock is envisioning for this product. So this is just not going to stop.
And to that point, you actually remove the risk from Main Street and you allow Wall Street to speculate with absolutely unbridled volatility. They actually love the volatility. They want it. And all of a sudden you remove Main Street. That is the ultimate win. And then when you pair the US Treasury market with Bitcoin, you've got two assets. You've got the risk-free asset, and then you've got Bitcoin, which I believe is the risk-free asset. And you can go absolutely wild on speculation and volatility in the markets and remove Main Street from having any downstream consequences like they had during the GFC. That's a really, really important point.
Let's talk about the Treasury market and Bitcoin, because maybe a few months ago here, Peter, you gave me a buzz at about 12:30 a.m. my time. We're on the other side of the world, so it's probably during the day for you. And we had a chat for about 30 minutes or an hour, and you're just telling me how Bitcoin could be integrated into the debt market and how it could be used as collateral. Do you remember that conversation? And if so, I'd love to talk a little bit more about how you envision that unfolding, Bitcoin working alongside the debt markets.
I think the primary reason for this was creating a principal protected note. And what that means is that would allow bond markets, insurance companies, and bank treasuries to participate in the upside and the volatility of Bitcoin, but it would also capital guarantee the investments in nominal terms to it. And so how that would work, and this only happens when interest rates are at 4 or 5%, but say you've got a 5-year principal protected note that you would issue $10 billion worth of it, and you buy $8 billion worth of treasury, and with that remaining 20%, you go and buy Bitcoin with it, because your 80% over a 5-year period will grow to the nominal cash that you put into it by the end of the term. But that then lets you put 20% of the portfolio into Bitcoin and ride the volatility with Bitcoin for the next 5 years. And by my calculations, backdating it would give a return of about risk-free return of 17% per annum by having 20% of your portfolio in Bitcoin. So all of a sudden, this is a new way of pricing and potentially recapitalizing the US banking sector, which I think our banking sector across the globe is in huge trouble from a liquidity perspective. I think we're effectively trading insolvent. But this is an opportunity, if the government gives the tick that they can hold this as good as treasuries, this is a way for the US banks to recapitalize themselves. So I look at that and think, here's the opportunity. We could have tens of trillions of dollars flow into that type of product. You know, we're issuing circa, I think it's I think it's about $10 trillion worth of bonds annually. What happens if 5 or 10% of that was to flow into Bitcoin? All of a sudden, we've got 10x or 50x what MicroStrategy is doing in the next 3 years with that single component. So I just look at the demand driver of that, and that's a way to capitalize the markets. And this is where actually I think you two have done the most work on this in the last few years, the multiplier. When you've got that much money coming into Bitcoin to funnel into it, all of a sudden that recapitalizes the markets way faster than any other investment that the banks or the treasuries could make. So what happens when trillions of dollars a year are flowing into Bitcoin to recapitalize that? We're looking at a quadrillion-dollar market for Bitcoin, which is 1,000x on where we are now, price-wise.
Bitcoin's got that quadrillion-dollar TAM. MicroStrategy's looking at a $300 billion debt market. I don't think anyone is paying attention to what could potentially be coming in the next 5 or 10 years. Speaking of the next...
But do you know how we know what's coming? Because we can fucking chart it in a power law. Get the fuck out of here.
Exactly. We're speaking about this cycle and power laws, British. What do you think are the biggest things we should be paying attention to over the next 12 months? I don't want to put a gun to your head and say what probabilities do you put on us reaching X number, but what do you think are the biggest drivers that could potentially make this next cycle different? Now, I wanted to quickly interrupt today's interview to give a massive shout out to our lead sponsor, Rhino Bitcoin. Rhino is a Bitcoin banking solution that combines traditional financial services with the power of Bitcoin. Created by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners, Rhino offers a range of different services. You can buy Bitcoin, you can sell Bitcoin, you can withdraw straight to cold storage, and you can even pay other people using the Bitcoin Lightning Network. You can also purchase gift cards with sats at the click of a button, and you can even connect a multi-signature setup to Casa, all by using the Rhino application. Additionally, you can even send cash globally to your family and friends using Rhino, and soon you'll be able to pay bills, borrow money against your Bitcoin, and even save Bitcoin for your retirement, all in the one seamless application. You guys can visit rhinobitcoin.com to download Rhino today and experience the future of Bitcoin banking.
There's two things, right? You've got to look at what could drive the peak and then what could create a floor that's high enough to scare the shit out of people to get into the asset. Because everyone right now, based on their infinite wisdom of 4 data points, is telling you that there's going to be an 80% correction, et cetera, et cetera. We've just walked through 2 or 3 avenues of capital. We haven't even touched the fact that there are real estate funds that are going to be coming up for maturity that need to get into something else. We haven't talked about there's equities funds that are going to be coming into the market. We haven't talked about any of that, right? So you should think about who's driving the capital, what their incentives are to drive that capital, why Bitcoin is a better alternative than what they were putting it into, and then you can analyze what you think is going to happen to the market. What I think is going to happen to the market is I don't think we're going to see, a $1 million day, right? We could, but I don't think it's going to happen right now. I think that we're going to drive up. It's certainly going to be unbelievable days. We're going to drive up, and then it's going to start turning around and people are going to go, here comes the crash. And then there's not going to be that much of a crash, right? And it's going to come down, correct. It's going to correct somewhere in the region of 50 to 60% and then go back up again, right? And I think it will do this based on the amount of capital that just has to find its home and the amount of capital that's being directed towards Bitcoin. So and by the way, we haven't even got into, hopefully the next US administration being friendly to Bitcoin yet, and what that brings along. What happens if they start extending, financing to Bitcoin miners in the US to build up, strategic resources in the US? All these other things that are happening that are unreal. We also, MicroStrategy is borrowing money at 0%, right? They're borrowing money at 0% to buy Bitcoin. We haven't even talked about the infinite scalability of that. Like, this is all just happening at this moment in time. BlackRock's in charge of this. I'm firmly in the chair that this is a BlackRock driven mission here, and Bitcoin will emerge as ESG 2.0 as ESG 1.0 has completely and utterly failed with a 5.5% CAGR. And this is, as Peter said, this is a renaissance of the American capital markets, and this is what I think. What happens when President Trump gets in there and starts bullying other countries to start getting Bitcoin allocations. We haven't factored any of this in. This is a very, very interesting period in Bitcoin's history, and I think the stupidest thing you can do is to sit there and go, it's going to be exactly like the last four data points when basically you have the biggest asset manager in the world, you have the biggest capital markets in the world, all choosing to adopt this one asset that has absolute finality of scarcity.
Couldn't agree more with that. We haven't even touched on policies which would drive capital to it as well. And one policy in the US that I look at and think this could be a huge weight of capital pushed in this space is what happens if they extended? There's a 1031 provision which allows you to roll over sale of an asset into the next asset if it's a multifamily property. And so you can compound your gains through time without any capital gains tax payable. What happens if they extended that 1031 provision to Bitcoin? I look at that and think we'd have two really big outcomes on this. Firstly, the huge property funds and fund managers, hedge fund managers who are heavily invested in that multifamily space could now, with approval of the government, pivot to Bitcoin, which is a much better asset. They could preserve their funds under management because you wouldn't want to lose the tax incentives that you garnered through time. You could pivot that to Bitcoin. And all of a sudden, what you do at the same time, the other side of the coin of that is that you would lower the housing costs dramatically across America because there's a flight of capital leaving that space. Now, there's an oversupply of homes in the US. Lots of people have got 2 or 3 homes. All of a sudden, you move all that capital and there's hundreds of billions of dollars a year in that space alone. You could incentivize that to move into Bitcoin. And if you think and apply that logic of, say, Jason Lowry, that this is a strategic imperative to have as much Bitcoin as possible, you can effectively turn the guns of the entire US economy to start accumulating and provide tax incentives and other policy initiatives to encourage every American to undertake and get as much Bitcoin as possible. And that's not even talking about, to your point earlier, about financing the Bitcoin. Yep. The US Federal Treasury and Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac could literally give out loans that are underwritten as long as they're held for 4 years or more with discounted interest rates to hold it. They're already subsidizing the American homeowner to the tune of probably 1% to 2% per annum. What happened if they extended that credit to Bitcoin on a 5-year minimum hold period?
It's bullish as fuck.
It's bullish as fuck. I think that's a great note to end today's rip on. Have you gentlemen got any final thoughts for the people today?
I think we just need to be patient. We're probably ahead of ourselves. But I think it's fun talking about this stuff. A lot of the reason I enjoy listening and talking about this so much is that we hopefully give others ideas to help bring these kind of things into existence. And I'd just like to say a very heartfelt thank you for both of you for all the content and education and hard work you do putting it out there.
Same to you, Peter.
You too, my friend. Yeah, you too. I mean, you're not slacking yourself, so it's a good thing. That's the beautiful thing about Bitcoin. Everyone can get involved. Everyone can talk to their audience. Everyone can bring people into this one asset, and there is no screwing anyone over because the only thing that matters, the only differentiator between all of us when it comes to Bitcoin is the entry price. That's never happened before in any other asset, right? If we were in real estate, I'd be trying to screw you. I'd be trying to, keep a deal from Peter. I'd be trying to do all it because that's just the mindset of all these other assets. Bitcoin's not like that. But if you're listening to this shit, the one thing you should be focused on if you're not there is getting to one Bitcoin. That's it. That is the only thing that's going to matter. Otherwise, you will regret it for the lifetime of your last name.
And you're also going to regret it if you don't custody that shit properly. So again, hit Peter up, links in the description if you need help custodying your Bitcoin. And gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. I had an absolute blast today.
Pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
My 2 favorite Bitcoiners.
If you enjoyed that interview with British and Peter, I have some fantastic news for you guys. We right now are talking about putting on a monthly roundtable where British, Peter, and myself break down one of the most important pieces of news and get incredibly bullish every single month. So if you want a monthly dose of hopium from 3 of the most bullish people in Bitcoin, leave us a comment down below. I'm going to try to make it happen. And with all that said, If you do want to hear a little bit more about how bullish British HODL is and why you need to get to 1 Bitcoin, we did interview British earlier on in the year. I'm going to link to that video right about there. And if you just want a little bit more Bitcoin bullish news, we also interviewed Michael Saylor in Prague in person a couple of months ago. Going to put a link to that video somewhere around there. With all that said, guys, hope you enjoyed today's interview. I hope you're looking forward to a monthly rip with Peter, British, and myself. I hope you enjoy it. 2 videos I slapped up on screen right there. I will see you in the next one.